The wind carried dust like a warning. It whipped down the main street of Rattlesnake Hollow, whistling through warped wooden slats and around the gallows post that hadn't been used in 3 years, but still leaned hungry into the dirt. Folks lined the boardwalks with that same half-hardened, half-curious look they wore during hangings, duels, or bad poker nights. And today the thing drawing them wasn't a crime or card game. It was a girl being sold. He arrived just after noon, hat pulled low, coat patched at the shoulders, boots scuffed from years of walking land that no longer bloomed. Josiah Cade wasn't the kind of man folks welcomed or warned. He passed like a shadow, too solid to ignore, too silent to invite. The ache in his right knee told him a storm was coming, but it wasn't weather that troubled him. It was the sound of the auctioneer. Next up, one more burden off the saloon tab. Barely 19, decent health, knows how to cook and keep her mouth shut. That's more than most wives I've known. Laughter spat across the crowd like tobacco juice. Josiah turned and saw her. She stood on the crude platform like a colt half broke and bound with invisible rope. Hair the color of stormed wheat clung to her temples. Her dress had once been blue, maybe sky-bright, but now sagged off one shoulder and clung damp to her waist. The hem was torn, muddied from weeks, maybe months, of being dragged across someone else's road. But it wasn't the dress that struck him. It was her eyes. They were dark, wide, and dry. Not begging. Not weeping. Just waiting. Like a candle in a boarded house that had long since stopped hoping for wind. She didn't tremble. Didn't plead. Didn't lower her head. Just watched. Josiah's mouth tightened. He reached into his coat for the list he'd made that morning, 3 items. Nails, coffee, mule. He was here for necessity, not tragedy. $10, barked a man near the front, already smiling too wide. Another voice called, 12. I like him quiet. The girl flinched at neither. Josiah glanced again at his list. He folded it. 20. The word came before he thought. It rose like a fire popping in a hearth he hadn't lit in years. Heads turned. One woman gasped. Someone murmured, "Isn't he the one who buried his wife with his baby girl? Don't he live out past Devil's Spine with nothing but dirt?" The auctioneer blinked. Did I hear right? 20, Josiah repeated louder now. In gold. Silence cracked like thunder. No man pays gold for what he doesn't intend to keep, whispered a voice behind him. Pause. Then the auctioneer grinned. Going once. 25, another shouted from the side of the crowd. A local rancher, broad as an ox and twice as mean. Josiah didn't blink. 30. Murmurs. Footsteps shifting. The rival hesitated. She's not worth it. I didn't ask you, Josiah said. The girl finally moved, just a tilt of the head, the barest question in her expression. Not gratitude. Not even surprise. Just the faintest flicker of disbelief. Or maybe memory. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Sold. $30 gold to Josiah Cade. A hush followed. Not reverence, just the stunned confusion of people who just watched a man do something he had no earthly reason to. The girl didn't speak as she stepped down. Didn't lift her skirts. Just walked until she stood beside him. He shrugged out of his coat and draped it over her shoulders. She stiffened. You can keep it, he said. They walked through the muddy street without speaking. Her bare feet slapped against the earth. He kept his pace steady. Behind them, the crowd parted in silence, like they were watching a ghost. When they reached his wagon, she finally asked, voice low, steady, "What happens now?" He looked at her, and something in his chest, a part that had been buried beside his daughter, shifted. I reckon you'll eat, he said. She hesitated, as if the idea of supper without price was strange. Then she climbed into the wagon and sat near the edge, silent again. He took the reins. The mule, old and bone-tired, groaned in protest but moved. They rode in silence. The town fell behind, swallowed by dust and distance. The sky darkened. The first low groans of thunder rumbled over the hills. He knew there'd be talk by morning. Knew the preacher would shake his head, the saloon keeper would laugh, and that rancher would spit whenever he saw him. Didn't matter. The girl beside him hadn't moved. But her eyes tracked the road. She wasn't looking for home. She didn't believe in it anymore. Still, when lightning flashed in the distance, she didn't flinch. He said without looking at her, "You don't owe me." She didn't reply. Just pulled his coat tighter around herself like she wasn't used to warmth, but maybe she'd keep it this time. By the time they reached his land, night had fallen. Rain hadn't started yet, but the wind had teeth. He pointed to the barn. I'll get a fire going inside. You can sleep in there till morning. We'll figure the rest after. Still no answer. As he walked toward the house, he glanced back once. She stood at the edge of the barn door, silhouetted by the flickering lantern he'd hung. Her hand gripped the wood like it might vanish. Then she stepped inside. He didn't know her name. Didn't ask. Not yet. But something told him she wasn't just a girl without a place. She was a fire no one had dared to light. And someone, somewhere, was going to regret ever letting her burn cold. He shut his door against the wind. But the storm hadn't even started yet. And someone out there wasn't done watching. The wind never brought the rain. It blew dry across Josiah Cade's land for 3 straight days, teasing the soil, curling dust like smoke from the barn's scorched ribs. He'd fixed most of the fire damage himself. No words, no complaints, just boards and hammer and ash. The girl hadn't asked questions when she saw the barn charred at its edges. She just stood in the doorway, holding the coat he'd given her like it was the last thing not taken from her. He learned quickly that she moved without sound. Never startled the chickens. Never slammed a door. She rose with the sun and worked without being told, sweeping the porch, hauling buckets from the well, boiling coffee even when it wasn't asked of her. She didn't say much and he didn't push. Words like storms had to come in their own time. On the 4th morning, she brought in eggs and set them gently on the table like they were fragile things, like maybe she knew what it was to be cracked without warning. He cleared his throat. You don't have to do all that. I know. She didn't look at him. But it helps. Her voice was soft, shaped like someone who'd spoken too many apologies in too few years. He offered her a chair. She sat on the edge like she might be asked to leave it at any moment. Rain still hadn't come, but the tension between them had begun to ease, like old hinges that just needed oil. Do you have a name? He asked. She paused. They called me Sarah. But I don't answer to that no more. What do you answer to? She looked at him then, eyes level and unreadable. What do you call someone you didn't ask for, didn't want, and can't quite figure out? He folded his hands. I call her a guest. That earned him something, a flicker at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile. Just proof there might be one buried beneath the grief. That night, he laid 2 blankets in the spare room instead of the barn. She hesitated in the doorway. It locks from the inside, he said. I know. She replied, but she kept her hand on the doorknob like it might disappear. Outside, thunder grumbled low, still dragging its heels. But not a single drop touched the dirt. The next day, a wagon rolled up the path. Josiah was chopping wood, shirt clinging to his back, sweat gathering at his brow. The girl stood behind him, helping stack the split logs. When the wheels creaked around the bend, he stopped cold. It was Eli Garner, rival rancher, 300 head of cattle, 300 fewer scruples. Well, hell, Eli called out, reins in hand. Didn't believe it when I heard. Thought folks were full of it. But here she is, clear as day. The Orphan prize. The girl froze behind the stack of wood. Josiah stepped forward, axe still in hand. You need something? Eli grinned. Just saying hello. Some of us were curious how long it'd take you to fall back into old habits. Taking in strays. Playing saint again. Josiah didn't move. Get off my land. She ain't yours, Cade. She ain't anyone's. Unless you're planning to marry her, which would be rich, or maybe just enjoying the perks without the paperwork. The axe thudded into the stump. Josiah walked up slow, steady. Eli laughed once, then raised both hands. Easy. Just neighborly talk. Josiah's voice dropped to gravel. One more word and you'll be picking your teeth out of your saddlebag. Eli looked past him to the girl. He's got a temper, don't he? She didn't blink. Didn't shrink. Eli clicked his tongue and turned the wagon. Suit yourself, Cade. But folks don't forget what they think they know. That night, Josiah sat on the porch, eyes on the horizon. The sky boiled with dark clouds that never broke. She brought him coffee. Thank you, he said, taking it from her. You always like storms that don't rain? I don't like storms at all. She sank to the steps beside him, legs drawn close. I used to. Why? They scared my mother. And when she was scared, she'd sing to drown it out. I'd pretend I was afraid just to hear her voice. He said nothing, just let the silence settle between them like dust. Then she whispered, I don't think I'm afraid anymore. Of storms? Of being here. He nodded once. Good. She hesitated, then asked, That man today, Eli. Why didn't you just let him talk? Josiah looked at the sky. Words turn to knives when folks speak em with a smirk. She traced her finger along the porch slat. He's not the only one who thinks I was bought for a reason. Does it matter what they think? I don't know yet. Do you think I bought you for that? She didn't answer. But when she rose to leave, she said without looking back, "No. I think you were just the only one who didn't look away." A week passed. She began asking more questions, about how the well pump worked, why one horse was always meaner than the others, why he kept a picture on the mantle but never dusted it. He answered when he could. That picture stayed untouched for a reason. It was the last image of his wife before the fever took her. She'd been holding their infant girl. Both were gone now. Buried behind the barn, near the cottonwood tree that hadn't bloomed in 2 years. The girl, no, the woman, started leaving small things there. A flower, a smooth stone, once even a drawing of a mother and baby in charcoal, folded under a jar lid to keep out the wind. He never mentioned it. She never said it was hers. But he'd seen her fingers blacken with charcoal that day. Then came the noise. Late one night, after the lamps had gone out and only embers glowed in the hearth, Josiah heard it. A soft, deliberate scrape against the barn. Not animal. Not wind. He stepped outside, rifle in hand. She was already there. Barefoot, in his old coat, standing like stone beside the porch, pointing to the shadows near the fence. They moved, 2 figures quick as rattlers. Josiah raised the rifle. "You'd best call out." Silence. Then a rock sailed through the air, cracking the porch rail. He fired once. The figures vanished into the dark. When the smoke cleared, she turned to him and said, "They'll be back." He nodded. "I know. We can't outrun it." "No. So what do we do?" "We stand." She took the rifle from him, checked the chamber, then handed it back. "You aim high," she said. "And you wait until they show teeth." He stared at her, surprised. "Where'd you learn that?" "Same place I learned not to cry when I was hit." He didn't ask more. She didn't offer more. But that night, she slept inside the house again. This time she didn't lock the door. And when he passed her room before dawn, he found her curled on the bed, not like a guest, not like a servant, but like someone slowly remembering what it meant to feel safe. The storm hadn't broken. But thunder was still rolling. And they were both still standing. It was a quiet morning, too quiet for spring. The sky hung low over the Cade homestead, pale as old parchment. Even the crows hadn't found reason to caw. Josiah stood at the edge of the barnyard, his breath misting just enough to make him uneasy. The girl, still nameless in town but no longer unknown, was feeding the chickens, humming under her breath. It was the first sound of music he'd heard from her. She didn't know he was watching. Didn't notice the man riding toward them from the ridge trail either. Not until the rhythm of hoofbeats grew louder than the wind. Josiah stepped off the porch and reached for the shotgun leaned against the doorframe. The rider was young, thin, and slicked with that false shine that men wore when they believed the law bent for their benefit. His hat was tilted just enough to look dangerous. But Josiah saw it for what it was, theater. He stopped 10 feet short of the barn, smiled, tipped his hat. "Morning, Miss Sarah." Her shoulders stiffened. The basket of feed tipped, scattering grain across the earth. Josiah's eyes narrowed. She didn't turn to look at him. Didn't speak. But her fingers gripped the edge of the basket so tightly the knuckles blanched. "You know this man?" Josiah asked quietly. "I do," she said, but it came out like a swallowed stone. The rider dismounted with flair, dusting off his jacket like someone important had asked to meet him. "Name's Adam Larch. I'm her kin. Or was. Her uncle by marriage, technically speaking. Her daddy's sister's husband." He paused for emphasis, then added, "God rest both their souls." Josiah remained still. Adam glanced around the yard, sniffed the air like he was inspecting the quality of dust. "Nice place you got here. Bit plain but steady. That your barn I heard caught fire last month." Josiah didn't answer. "I heard you bought her at that little auction," Adam continued, voice oily. "Quite the scandal. Thought I'd ride out and see for myself. Family's family after all. Even the wayward ones." Sarah finally turned, her voice low but firm. "You're not family. You never were." He smiled wider, like her words meant nothing. "That's not what the records say." Josiah took a step forward. "What do you want?" Adam's eyes flicked toward him. "A simple exchange. She's not legally yours. She was handed over in a questionable deal, and some of us in town might not take kindly to a man harboring a girl without papers. Could raise complications. Unless, of course, you make it worth my while." Sarah's breath caught. Josiah didn't move. "You're blackmailing me." Adam shrugged. "I'm offering a gentleman's chance to settle something quietly. Ain't that what you folks out here love? Quiet." The chickens pecked at the spilled grain, oblivious to the storm building in the silence. Josiah took another step, slow and deliberate. Get off my land. Adam held his hands up, backing toward his horse. I'll be back tomorrow. With proof. You'll want to be reasonable when the sheriff gets involved. Then he turned and rode off, whistling a hymn. That night, Josiah found Sarah curled on the porch, knees pulled to her chest. She wasn't crying, but her breath shook with each exhale like she was trying to hold something inside and failing. Why didn't you tell me about him? He asked. She stared ahead. I thought he was gone. What did he do to you? She didn't answer for a long while. Then, in a voice so soft he had to lean closer, she said, He told me I was lucky to have a roof. That the dead didn't complain. That pretty girls learned faster when they stayed quiet. Josiah's jaw tightened, fists curling. I thought if I stayed invisible he'd forget me, she whispered. He didn't. He sat beside her, not touching, not speaking, just waiting. After a while she looked at him. If you let me go now, no one would blame you. I would. I'm not your kin. I'm not your problem. You're not a problem. She shook her head, eyes rimmed red. Then why does it feel like everything I touch ends in fire? He thought about that. Then answered with the only truth he had. Because no one's ever stood long enough to see what happens when you don't burn. She didn't reply. But she didn't move away either. The next day Adam returned, this time with a paper and a sneer. Sheriff Leland rode beside him, eyes wary. A few curious townsfolk trailed behind on horseback, keeping a cautious distance. Josiah met them at the gate. Got your proof? He asked. Adam waved the paper. Guardianship document. Dated and signed. The sheriff squinted at it. Seems legal enough. Girl was handed to him after her parents died. By the county court. That paper's forged, Sarah said from the porch. My father never signed over anything. Sheriff Leland frowned. Even so, she's not 18 by this account. You bought her without proper release. I paid to stop a worse man from winning, Josiah said. That's the truth. Intent don't change law, Leland muttered. Adam grinned. So, what'll it be, Cade? You let her go with me, peaceful. Or we take this to court, and folks start wondering what else you're hiding. Sarah stepped forward. I'll go, she said flatly. Josiah's head snapped toward her. No. She met his gaze. If I go, it buys you time. He wants the story. Not me. Let him take it. I'll find my way back. No, he repeated, voice like steel. But Adam was already off his horse, grabbing her arm. She didn't scream. Didn't pull away. Josiah raised the rifle. Sheriff Leland shouted, Cade, don't. Adam froze. Josiah didn't lower the gun. Take one more step, and I swear by the grave of my wife, I'll put you under the cottonwood beside her. The world stilled. Adam's grip loosened. Sarah yanked free and stepped behind Josiah. Sheriff Leland dismounted slowly, hands open. We can't fix this here. Bring her to town. Let the court decide. Josiah nodded once. We'll come. 3 days later, they stood inside the town's old church, makeshift courtroom by necessity. Word had spread like fire in a dry field. Everyone came. Even those who'd spat Josiah's name weeks before. Judge Merritt, old and half-deaf, presided with a scowl. Adam spoke first, papers, charm, confident tone. Sarah followed. She stood tall, voice firm despite her trembling hands. They passed me around after my parents died. No schooling. No guardianship. Just silence. When Adam came, he said it was my fault my mother was gone. He said if I ever left, he'd make sure I was blamed for everything. The crowd murmured. He forged the paper, she said. I know because I saw him do it. Do you have proof? The judge asked. No, she said. Just scars. She lifted her sleeve. Gasps echoed. Josiah stood to speak next, but the judge waved him down. Then something strange happened. A small boy in the back raised his hand. The judge frowned. This ain't school, boy. The preacher stood beside the boy. Let him speak. The boy walked forward, holding a drawing, charcoal lines rough but clear. It was Sarah sitting with chickens. Smiling. My sister said she's kind. That she tells us stories while we wait for our pa at the market. Another child stood. Then another. She fixed my coat. She gave me bread when I had none. She taught us how to read our names. Sarah's hand covered her mouth. She hadn't known they'd been watching. Judge Merritt looked around. Then sighed. This ain't a court built for justice. But sometimes a town knows better than a book. This man, Adam, is hereby stripped of any guardianship. The girl stays where she is. Case closed. Applause broke out, not loud, not wild. But real. Adam stormed out. Josiah looked at Sarah. She looked back, eyes swimming, hands still shaking. They rode home without words. Only when the house came into view did she speak. "Do you still want me here?" He slowed the mule. "It ain't about want. It's about what's right." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her, really looked. "You asked if I want you here." She nodded. "I do," he said. "But more than that. I want you to want it too." "I think I do." "Then that's enough." She took a breath, full and deep. The air smelled like new rain. At last. That night, they lit a fire inside the hearth, brighter than usual. And for the first time she sat beside him, close enough for their shoulders to touch. The storm had passed. But firelight still danced. The days after the trial should have been quiet. But the town had never been good at silence. Whispers clung to the streets like dust, seeping through church pews, back alley doors, and sewing circles. Some folks claimed Josiah Cade had taken in a girl just to ease his guilt. Others said she'd bewitched him, too quiet to be innocent, one woman muttered over pie crust. But there were those who began to nod when her name was mentioned. Who remembered a loaf of bread on a doorstep, a stitched sleeve, a kind word for a child who couldn't read. There was still suspicion, yes. But there was also beginning to be something else. Respect. Still, the trial had stirred up more than just gossip. It had stirred the old wounds, the kind townspeople didn't want reopened. So when Sarah walked into Jenkins' Mercantile 3 days after the verdict, coin in her palm and a list in her hand, she felt the change before a word was spoken. The room stiffened. Old Mr. Jenkins pretended not to see her. A woman behind the counter glanced, then looked quickly away. Sarah waited. Finally, a teenage boy stepped up and asked, "Can I help you, miss?" She handed him the list. Just the usual. Soap, needles, 2 yards of cotton cloth, and lard. The boy nodded, but his hands were unsteady as he filled the sack. Behind him, Jenkins whispered something too quiet to catch. But Sarah caught the meaning. He didn't want her there. She took the sack when it was handed over and placed the coins carefully on the counter. "Thank you." Outside, the air felt thinner, like she'd been holding her breath the whole time. Josiah was waiting with the mule cart. "They treat you decent?" She nodded. "Mostly." He looked at her face and said nothing more. But his jaw was tight the whole ride home. That night, under a sky too wide to hold anyone's secrets, Sarah stood barefoot on the porch, listening to the coyotes in the hills. Her eyes traced the stars like stitches she could never reach. Josiah joined her without a word, holding out a cup of coffee. "Still thinking about town?" She took the cup. "I'm trying not to." "You did good. What you said in that courtroom, it changed folks." "I'm not sure it did." "It changed me," he said. Her breath caught. He turned his eyes toward the dark ridgeline. "I never told anyone what it was like, losing them. My wife. My girl. You don't have to." "I do." He sipped the coffee, letting the words gather like rain clouds. "After I buried them, I stopped speaking for 3 weeks. Preacher came out, tried to get me to talk. I nearly shot him for standing on their grave. Thought maybe if I just kept my hands busy, building fences, raising stock, maybe the ache would drain out through my boots." She looked at him. "It didn't," he said. "Not until you." She blinked. He added softly, "You brought sound back to the house." Neither spoke for a while after that. When she finally whispered, "What am I to you, Josiah?" her voice trembled. He didn't answer quickly. The silence wasn't hesitation, it was weight. "You're someone I didn't expect," he said at last. "Someone I'm starting to pray stays." It didn't take long for the rumors to return. They came not from drunks or wagging tongues this time, but from the men who fancied themselves protectors of the town's values. They tolerated Josiah's testimony in court because it had ended a bad man. But as spring crept into bloom, so did their discomfort with a girl once auctioned now living in a man's home without ceremony, without title, and without apology. The mayor called for a public meeting. It was to be held in the schoolhouse on neutral ground. Josiah received the notice folded under a horseshoe on his gate. Sarah found it first. Her hands trembled when she read it. "They want to put you on trial again," she said, voice hollow. "No," Josiah answered. "They want to put us on display." The schoolhouse filled before dusk. Farmers, shopkeepers, wives with children squirming on their laps. The preacher sat in the back, arms crossed. The sheriff leaned against the wall near the door. Mayor Harold Barnaby stood near the chalkboard, clearing his throat. "We gather tonight to speak plainly. This ain't law and it ain't judgment, just townsfolk talking. Mr. Cade, you're welcome to answer or not. But people have concerns." Josiah stood at the back, Sarah beside him. Barnaby continued, We know what happened with Larch. We backed you in court. But the matter of appearances, well, some say it's unbecoming for a girl to live with a man unmarried. Especially one with her past. Sarah's face went still. Josiah took a breath. And what should I have done? Left her to be sold again? Let her starve? She's not a stray dog you keep at arm's length. Barnaby raised his hand. No one's accusing you of anything wrong. But decency. Decency, Josiah snapped, would have stopped that auction before it began. A murmur rippled through the room. He stepped forward. You're not here because you question her. You're here because she reminds you what you let happen. The preacher rose then. He's right. Heads turned. I saw her first Sunday back in town. She lit a candle without trembling. She took communion with tears in her eyes. If that's not a sign of redemption, I don't know what is. Sarah looked down. A voice called from the front row. Mrs. Garvey, the widow who ran the sewing circle. I gave her a coat pattern last week. She fixed it better than I ever could. Another voice, young Thomas from the mercantile. She reads stories to my sister when she brings eggs. Someone else stood. Then another. Sarah stared stunned. They weren't defending her out of pity. They were standing up because she had earned it. The mayor cleared his throat. I suppose, maybe we were too quick to judge. Josiah took Sarah's hand. She didn't pull away. He spoke once more, voice low but clear. I didn't ask her to stay because I needed help. I asked her because she made this place feel like home again. A silence fell so soft it felt holy. Then Mrs. Garvey smiled. Well, it's about time someone said it out loud. They left the meeting hand in hand, beneath a sky washed clean by wind. Outside, someone had tied a ribbon to their wagon. Yellow, fluttering in the breeze. Neither spoke of it. They didn't need to. Back at the ranch, the fire burned low. Sarah stood at the table, folding a piece of linen she'd meant to hem days ago. Josiah set a kettle on the stove and leaned against the frame. She turned to him. You know they'll still talk. I know. They'll wonder when, if, we're getting married. He met her eyes. What do you want? She stepped toward him. Not trembling. Not unsure. I want a life that doesn't ask me to explain myself. He nodded. Then let's build that. She placed the folded cloth on the table. Together? He smiled just a little. If you'll have me. She didn't speak right away. Then quietly she said, You're the first man who ever asked. And that, to Josiah Cade, was answer enough. He didn't reach for her. She stepped forward instead. The wind outside howled once and then fell still. In its silence, something new took root. Not trial. Not judgment. But belonging. The letter arrived on a morning too bright for grief. It was tucked in beside the eggs Josiah had fetched from the neighbor's wagon, sealed in blue wax and addressed to her in clean, careful script. Sarah read it once, then again, standing barefoot in the kitchen, the hem of her dress dusted in flour. He watched her from the doorway, arms crossed, pretending not to notice how still she'd gone. They want me to teach, she said quietly. In Dawson Ridge. 2 counties over. He nodded once. It's a proper school. Real roof, blackboards, children who already know their letters. He looked down at his boots. Sounds like a fine place. She didn't speak. Not for a long time. Then, almost to herself, she said, Maybe I could start again there. Not be the girl who was sold, or saved, or watched in stores like she might break something. He nodded again. You think I should go? I think, Josiah said carefully, that if you leave because you're running from something, it'll follow you. But if you leave because you're walking toward what's yours, I'd ride the first mile with you myself. Her voice broke then. Would you? I'd ride, till your trail was yours alone. The week that followed was quiet and long. Sarah packed only what she'd brought and what she'd made with her own hands. No borrowed coats, no gifts she hadn't earned. The townsfolk came by one at a time, each in their own way. A jar of preserves. A hair ribbon. A book of psalms with the pages still crisp. Mrs. Garvey hugged her too tight. The sheriff tipped his hat and said, You made us better, miss. Josiah said little. He showed her how to oil the wagon wheels. Checked her saddlebag 3 times. Restitched the hem of her travel dress where the thread had frayed. He fixed everything he could except the ache in his chest. The morning she left, he helped her tie the last strap. She stood by the mule cart, one hand on the seat, the other clenched around nothing at all. You'll write? He asked. If I can learn how. He didn't smile. Do you want me to stay? She whispered. He didn't answer. Because the truth was, yes. Yes, he wanted her to stay. With a fierceness that stole his breath at night and bent his knees in prayer he hadn't uttered in years. But he also knew that love wasn't a cage. It was a door left open even when your heart begged you to bolt it shut. She climbed up. He handed her the reins. The town gathered along the road, not like a parade but like a farewell. Like something solemn. No one cheered. But no one turned away either. Sarah didn't cry. Not until she passed the edge of town and looked back one last time, and saw Josiah Cade still standing by the post where she'd first stepped off that auction block, hat in hand, heart bare as the morning sky. It was 2 weeks later when she returned. Riding fast, dust in her wake, face red from wind and sun. She didn't stop at the sheriff's office or the general store. She didn't knock at any doors. She rode straight to the Cade ranch. Josiah was fixing a broken gate when he heard the hooves. He looked up, eyes narrowing against the glare. Sarah slid down before the mule had even stopped. Walked straight to him, dress wrinkled, hair loose. He didn't speak. She didn't give him time. They didn't need a teacher, she said. Turns out someone else had already taken the post. Said they never sent that letter. Josiah frowned. Then who? I don't know. But I think maybe, it doesn't matter. Silence stretched between them, full and warm. I didn't come back because I failed, she said. I came back because I found what I'd been looking for. It just wasn't there. His throat worked. And what was it? A place where I didn't have to explain who I'd been. Where someone looked at me and saw not what I survived, but what I could become. He stepped forward. Sarah, you don't have to. I want to, she said. And I've made up my mind. She held out her hand. He stared at it for a moment, calloused fingers curling. Then he took it. And pulled her into his arms like a man who'd waited too long to believe in second chances. They married under the cottonwood tree. No invitations, no lace. Just a preacher, the wide sky, and folks from town who came not for the food but for the feeling. Children sat cross-legged in the grass. The sheriff brought pie. The widow Garvey cried harder than anyone, and no one mocked her for it. Sarah wore a dress she stitched herself, plain muslin, soft as a whisper. Josiah didn't wear a tie. But when he said, I do, his voice didn't waver. After the vows, Sarah stood beneath the branches, hand on her belly. She wasn't pregnant. She just stood like someone who finally knew they were real. And the town, hardened, stubborn, slow to change Rattlesnake Hollow, did something it rarely did. It wept. Not out of pity. But because they'd all watched a man do something the world had forgotten how to praise. He had bought a girl nobody wanted. And turned her into a woman everybody admired. Sometimes, years later, when folks told the tale, they said Josiah Cade changed the town by standing up in court. But the ones who knew better remembered what happened after. The way he taught her to ride. The way she taught the town to read. The way their porch light never went out, not even in the worst storms. And how the girl once sold with no name left behind something greater than gold. She left behind the truth. That dignity, once returned, can bloom even in dry soil. And that love, when chosen freely, can bring a town to tears, not in sorrow, but in reverence. The wind moved like it had purpose that night, curling around the eaves of the old Walker homestead as if testing the bones of the house, pressing against the windows like a memory trying to return. Rain hit the panes in sharp angles. Inside, the hearth spat low flame, and Eloise sat with her mending, fingers calloused, lamp dimmed low to save oil. She hadn't spoken a word aloud all day. The quilt in her lap was patched too many times to count, but her needle moved as if it mattered. Something about fixing what had frayed made her feel less like something torn herself. Her shawl, heavy with damp from the earlier storm, clung to her shoulders. A kettle hissed behind her, the scent of rosemary and old broth barely disguising the musty chill of a house too long kept by one woman alone. Then came the knock. 3 times, slow, firm, unhurried. She didn't startle. She simply froze, the thread between her fingers held taut in mid-stitch. Another knock. She rose, quietly, not out of fear but caution carved from years of solitude. Folks didn't come to her door. Not anymore. And no one ever knocked in weather like this unless the need outweighed the shame. She opened it a crack. Rain sliced sideways in the wind. A man stood there, soaked to the bone, mud up to his knees, one arm tucked against his ribs like something was cracked underneath. His wide-brimmed hat dripped, shadowing a face too tired to beg and too proud to lie. One look and she knew he was no drifter. I lost the wagon crossing Red Hollow. Horse spooked. Wheel shattered. His voice was hoarse but steady. Didn't mean to bother a lady this late. You're bleeding, she said quietly. He gave a shrug that looked painful. It'll stop. Eloise opened the door wider but only just. I don't keep liquor. No doctor nearby. But there's fire. And stew. He hesitated, not at her words but her gaze. Then he nodded once, stepping in with care, dripping water and silence as he passed her. She watched him take in the room, wood walls, rough shelves, an old Bible by the window, but his eyes rested longest on the empty second chair at the table. She gestured to it, then to the fire. He sat by the hearth, removing his hat but not his coat. She saw then the blood staining his shirt at the side. Not deep, just enough to tell a story. "Name's Boaz," he said without looking up. "Eloise." It felt like a whisper in a cathedral. She returned to the kitchen, ladled stew into a chipped bowl, placed it in front of him without ceremony. He thanked her with a nod, then ate in a way that didn't rush, didn't presume, just enough to show he'd gone long enough without. When he finished, she handed him a cloth and a pan of warm water. He cleaned the wound himself. Didn't flinch, didn't ask for help. "How far were you headed?" she asked at last. "North of Dry Creek. Selling off a stretch of land nobody wants. Not much left there but stones and dead roots." Eloise looked at him a moment. "And you?" He met her eyes. "Same." She folded her hands in her lap, thumbs worrying each other. The silence stretched again, not uneasy, just unfamiliar. A stranger in her home, the scent of rain and pine still clinging to his coat. Yet there was something about the way he didn't fill the room with words. As if he knew how to let silence mean something. Outside the rain deepened. The wind picked up again, trying the windows with new insistence. "There's a pallet by the fire," she offered. "I won't take your bed." I didn't offer it. For the first time he smiled, but it was faint, more in his eyes than his mouth. She fetched an old wool blanket from the cedar chest, laid it down beside the hearth and left him to it. When she returned with her mending, he was already lying down, one arm over his eyes, the other across his chest like a soldier at rest. "Thank you," he said softly. She didn't answer. Just sat down again in her corner chair and took up the needle. The storm would rage a while longer. So would the thoughts crowding her mind. But in that quiet cabin something shifted. A thread pulled gently between two people who'd stopped hoping for company, yet hadn't fully given up on warmth. Sometime past midnight she looked over. He was asleep, brow furrowed even in rest, as if his dreams had work left in them. She stared at the low flame, her hand still on the needle. The last man who'd slept by her fire had never left. By morning the wind would turn, and so would the world outside. But in that moment, there was only the sound of rain, the crack of wood settling, and a stranger, half-healed, half-trusted, sleeping beside the fire she'd kept lit all these years for no one. And for the first time in seasons she didn't feel quite so alone. Morning rose not in gold but in hush. The storm had passed, but the air still held the smell of wet dust and pine sap. Mist clung low across the fields like breath not yet exhaled. Eloise stood on her porch with a tin cup of water, not sipping, just holding it, watching the world try to remember its shape after the rain. Boaz emerged from the cabin behind her, slow in his steps, a stiffness in his ribs from the fall. He didn't speak at first, only lifted his hat in a quiet gesture and looked out toward the road. The kind of man who, even after sleep, still carried the posture of trouble. "Thank you," he said finally. "For the fire. For the quiet." Eloise didn't answer right away. She nodded once. "You'll find your way?" He looked down the path, where the wagon had broken and vanished under last night's washout. "Somehow." Then meeting her eyes again, "You sure you'll be all right?" She gave a small smile, thin, practiced. "I was all right yesterday. I'll be all right today." He tipped his hat and walked slow into the lifting fog, boots sucking softly in the mud, leaving behind nothing but steam and boot tracks. She watched until he disappeared past the ridge, her hands wrapped tight around the tin cup, though the water had gone warm. By mid-morning the town already knew. They always knew. Fern Tilly's kitchen window faced the road, and Fern had eyes sharper than her tongue. She'd seen the figure leaving Eloise's gate, hat low, coat dark, like a sin walking upright. And that was all it took. By the time the church bell chimed 10, the gossip had grown legs and galloped straight into the ear of Judge Whitlow. Sheriff didn't ride hard. He rode slow. Deputy Lem Pickens showed up first, knocking at Eloise's door with his hat in his hands and a kind of boyish shame in his eyes. "Miss Eloise," he said, twisting the brim. "Judge wants to see you." She wiped her hands on her apron and said nothing, just reached for her shawl. She knew better than to ask why. When a woman like her, alone, no kin, and history hanging around her neck like a bell, let a man inside her home during a storm, the town didn't ask questions. They passed sentence. At the courthouse, Judge Whitlow sat with his shoulders hunched forward like a man constantly waiting for the world to misbehave. His office smelled of old wood and sweat. He gestured to the chair before she was even fully inside. "Have a seat, Miss Walker." "I'd rather stand," she replied, voice steady. He adjusted his spectacles, looked over a slip of paper that was surely blank. "It's come to my attention," he said, as though it hadn't come to everyone's already, "that you harbored an unwed man overnight in your dwelling. You confirm that?" "I offered a stranger shelter in a storm. He was hurt." He tapped a knuckle on the desk. "This town holds standards. And while I understand storms and injuries, I also understand appearances. You were seen. He was seen leaving. You understand what that implies." Eloise felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from guilt but fury. She stared at the window, at the slow-moving clouds, counting her breath. "I offered kindness," she said. "Yes," Whitlow replied. "And now you'll offer restitution. Unless you wish for your name to carry further shame, there's a solution." He folded his hands. "The man Boaz McCrae. Rancher. Widowed. He will marry you." She blinked. 1,000 things pressed against her ribs, none of them words. "You think this justice?" she finally whispered. "I think it mercy," he said too quickly. "And if I refuse? You'll be labeled. You'll be watched. You'll be dismissed from the boarding votes and the church aid. It won't be my hand that does it, but I won't stop it." Lem Pickens shifted uncomfortably by the door but said nothing. Eloise turned her gaze to the floor. Her hands, rough from work, clenched at her sides. "What if he refuses? Then the blame falls square on you. It always did." She walked out without another word. The sun had broken through the clouds, lighting the muddy street in sharp contrast. She felt its heat on her face, but it did not warm her. Boaz McCrae stood by the dry goods store, talking low with the blacksmith. When he saw her, his brow furrowed. She approached slowly, every step scraping against the edge of pride. "They want us married," she said. He said nothing. She looked up at him. "To keep the town from tearing me apart." Still nothing. Finally he asked, "And you?" "I want the world to forget my name." He studied her then, quiet, jaw tense. "It's not a small thing." "I didn't ask for any of it," she replied. "Not the storm. Not your blood. Not their judgment." Boaz looked away, down the street where folks had started to gather in doorways, pretending not to watch. He exhaled hard. "You're asking me to be a fence," he said. "Between you and what they throw. I'm asking you to be what you were last night. Quiet. Human." He nodded once, slow. "Then meet me by the judge's steps at sundown. I won't make you wait." She didn't thank him. She didn't smile. She just turned and walked the long road back to her cabin. That afternoon the sun dried the puddles, but it could not dry her shame. Fern Tilly's curtains fluttered again. A boy laughed as he pointed at her from across the square. A woman pulled her daughter closer when Eloise passed the bakery window. But Eloise kept walking, head high, heart quiet. Back at home she packed away the mending, swept the floor twice, then sat by the fire, waiting. As shadows lengthened across the floorboards and the orange of sunset curled through the cracks in the wall, she didn't cry. She didn't pray. She only thought of the stranger who had knocked in the rain, and wondered what it meant that he hadn't walked away. Outside the bells rang 6. And this time they were ringing for her. The sun had long since slipped behind the ridgeline, but its memory lingered in the dust that floated through the judge's parlor, glowing like old firelight. There were no guests, no music, no flowers. Just a lean wooden table that had once served as a writing desk, and a Bible set open between them like a tired witness. Eloise stood on the left, her shawl pulled tight, hands clasped low. Boaz stood on the right, one hand on the brim of his hat, the other still resting against his ribs out of habit. Judge Whitlow looked between them as if they were offenders of a quiet law, not participants in something sacred. He read from the book with a tone more suited to court fines than covenant. "Do you, Boaz McCrae, take this woman?" Boaz's voice was firm if dry. "I do." The judge turned. "Do you, Eloise Walker, take this man?" She answered before the words had fully formed. "Amen." The judge paused. His eyes flicked to her, then back to the page, but he said nothing. He closed the book. "So be it." No one clapped. No one kissed. Boaz nodded once, as if confirming a debt had been settled. Eloise's hands didn't move. The paper was signed in quiet strokes, the pen scratching like footsteps on gravel. Deputy Lem stood in the corner with his hat pressed to his chest, saying nothing, his eyes fixed on a spot on the wall. When it was done, they walked out together, side by side, not arm in arm, into the twilight of a town that had already written its version of the story. Doors opened just long enough for glances. Fern Tilly's silhouette stood like judgment behind her window lace. They didn't speak as they passed the schoolhouse, or the old cooper's shop, or the hollowed-out blacksmith's shed. Only when they reached the path beyond town did Boaz say softly, "I'll stay in the lean-to if you prefer." Eloise stopped walking. "No." He turned to her. "I didn't do this to live like I'm guilty," she said. "You'll stay by the fire. It's warmer there." He nodded, the lines around his mouth unreadable in the half-light. Back in the cabin, she lit the lantern low and set down 2 bowls of stew. They sat at the table, their movements careful but not awkward, like 2 people used to silence and shadows. Boaz ate slowly, his left hand trembling once when he reached for the salt. She noticed but didn't speak of it. After supper he took his place again near the hearth. The same blanket, the same chair, now without the question of leaving. He unrolled his coat, leaned back against the wall and exhaled. Eloise watched him a moment. "Why didn't you walk away?" He blinked slowly. "I've walked away from things before. This time felt like something I shouldn't." "That's not much of a reason." "No," he agreed. "But maybe it's enough." She said nothing, only stood and took her own seat near the window, her fingers once again worrying a piece of mending. Not for need, just something to hold. Night deepened. The fire crackled. Outside an owl called once, then fell silent. The next morning, they moved around each other like early dancers, finding rhythm in unspoken steps. She fetched water. He gathered kindling. When she slipped while hauling the bucket, he caught her elbow, steadying her. Their eyes met. She nodded in thanks, and his hand let go slowly, as if he hadn't touched another soul in years. By the 3rd day he'd fixed the door hinge without asking. She let him. By the 4th she mended the lining of his coat. He didn't speak of it, but wore it the next morning with a small clearing of his throat that sounded suspiciously like gratitude. They weren't lovers. They weren't friends. They were something else, 2 shadows finding the shape of each other, not with light but with time. Boaz never asked about her past. But Eloise caught him one evening staring at the corner of the room where a locket hung by an old nail, dusty, unopened. She said, "That was my mother's." He looked away. "You take after her?" "No," she said. She was soft, gentle. "I came out like stone." Boaz's voice was quiet. "Stone holds up better in storms." They didn't touch. Not deliberately. But the nearness grew. She noticed how he took his tea now, 1 spoon of sugar, no milk. He noticed she always braided her hair before sleep, even when she thought no one was watching. The town, of course, kept its eyes on them. By the end of the week, Eloise was no longer greeted at the mercantile. Coins were left on the counter. No words. The Reverend's wife moved pews when she entered church. And the children, especially the girls, were kept away. Boaz saw it, and said nothing. Until one evening, as he mended a loose floorboard and she stirred beans in the pot, he asked, "You regret it?" She didn't turn. "Regret's a heavy word. But does it sit with you?" She paused, then stirred slower. "It sat with me long before you did." Boaz put down the hammer. "I can take my leave if that makes it easier." Eloise turned to him, finally. Her voice low but unwavering. "What makes it easier is someone who doesn't ask me to explain myself. What makes it easier is having someone who doesn't need to be told not to hurt me." He looked at her like the sentence held something sacred. "Then I'll stay." That night she brought him a second blanket. Their hands touched in the exchange. Neither pulled away. When she lay in bed, she heard him breathing by the hearth, steady, present. And though the fire was low and her body still cold beneath the quilts, something in her chest had gone warm. Not love. Not yet. But maybe the start of something that didn't need vows to be real. The wind changed on the 11th day. Snow arrived not with drama but with stillness, the kind that muffled even memory. It drifted down like ash over the prairie, turning fence posts ghost white and softening the world. Inside the cabin the fire cracked low. Eloise stirred it with the iron poker, watching embers glow like small rebellions in the dark. Boaz was outside mending the upper barn door. The latch had rotted, and every time the wind caught it, the wood groaned like it had something to confess. She told him not to bother, it wasn't his to fix, but he only said, "I'm here. I may as well be useful." That was his way. Quiet usefulness. No declarations, no demands. He hadn't so much as touched her wrist again since that night he steadied her by the well. But every morning there was coffee brewed before she rose. Every evening her boots were scraped clean by the door. From the window she watched him now, coat dusted with snow, hat low, moving slow but sure. There was a steadiness to him she hadn't expected from a man with such sad eyes. She returned to the hearth, unfolded the letter she kept hidden behind the mantel clock. It was yellowed with age and folded 3 times. The ink had bled in the rain once, but the words were still legible. To Mr. Harlan Tate, this letter confirms transfer of property rights in exchange for Miss Eloise Walker, to be wed upon arrival. The girl is sound of limb with no known defects. I will not seek return. Her father's signature was still there, sharp as a knife wound. She folded it again, pressing it flat. Some things you didn't burn, no matter how much they begged for fire. Behind her, the door creaked open and Boaz stepped in, breath misting. His hands were raw from the cold, but his eyes were calm. Latch won't hold another winter, he said. Neither will that roof, she replied, nodding to the corner where snowmelt dripped onto the floor. He looked up, then offered the faintest smile. We'll patch it. She watched him remove his coat, hang it on the peg beside hers. That simple act, his things next to hers, felt more intimate than anything they'd shared yet. Later that evening, as the storm settled in, he surprised her. I never told you about her, he said, staring into the fire. My wife. Eloise didn't speak, only turned slightly in her chair to face him. Her name was Miriam. She died birthing our second son. The baby didn't live long either. That was 5 winters ago. He rubbed his palm like the memory lived there. I sold the land we meant to raise him on. Couldn't walk those fields without seeing her. Eloise's voice came out soft. Is that what brings you here? Running from ghosts? No, he said. They travel light. I carry mine. The silence between them thickened, not heavy but full. She rose, crossed the room and sat beside him. Not touching, just near enough that her warmth might reach him if he wanted it to. She reached behind the mantel and handed him the folded letter. He read it once, then again. He didn't ask questions. He didn't look at her like a thing broken. He simply folded the letter once more and said, You were a girl. I was 17. Then it was theft, not shame. She blinked, eyes burning. No one had ever said it like that. They sat like that until the fire dimmed. The next morning brought sunlight sharp and clean, the kind that makes snow shimmer like something holy. But the town didn't see it that way. At the church steps, whispers turned louder. Fern Tilly had told someone who had told someone else, and now the talk was that the marriage wasn't real. That Boaz had never claimed her properly. That a woman like Eloise might have trapped him out of desperation. The word, annulment, was tossed around like a horseshoe, casually, cruelly. It came to a head when Reverend Pratt refused to let them take communion together. Said it might sow confusion among the flock. Boaz looked the Reverend in the eye and said nothing. Eloise turned and walked out. Back in town square, Judge Whitlow called for them again. You've not consummated the union, he stated flatly. And if the man does not defend your honor, Miss Walker, the town sees no reason to keep honoring a name you're borrowing. Eloise felt her stomach turn, but she kept her spine straight. Boaz's voice came low. You want proof of a marriage? The judge raised a brow. Words have power, Mr. McCrae. Silence has consequence. Boaz stepped forward, not to the judge but toward the gathered townsfolk behind him. Churchgoers, farmers, widows and gossips, people who once nodded to Eloise when her mother was still alive. He raised his voice, not loud but firm. A woman can offer a man food and fire and not owe him her body. She can open her door without selling her name. This town's full of folks who confuse mercy with invitation. A murmur rolled through the crowd. I married her, he continued. Not because I had to, but because she opened her door to me when no one else would. And if that shames you more than your own cruelty, then the shame ain't hers to carry. Eloise stood frozen. Not because of what he said, but because no man had ever spoken for her without trying to speak over her. Judge Whitlow narrowed his eyes. This isn't a court of sympathy, Mr. McCrae. Boaz stepped back. Then it's not a court I recognize. They returned to the cabin in silence. That night, she made stew again, though her hands trembled as she cut the potatoes. Boaz sat near the fire, staring at the same plank floor, hat on his knee. When she placed the bowl before him, he didn't lift his spoon. Just looked up and said, I meant it. I know. I'll sleep outside if you need room to breathe. I need you here, she said. And that was it. No kiss. No embrace. Just 2 people who knew that fire doesn't need to blaze to stay alive. She fell ill 2 nights later. Fever came swift, and by dawn her lips were cracked and dry, skin flushed with heat. Boaz stayed by her side, waking through the night to wipe her brow, spoon broth into her mouth, rub warmth back into her hands. He read to her from the Bible, not the fire and brimstone parts but psalms slow and low like lullabies for the weary. On the third day she opened her eyes and found him asleep in the rocking chair, chin to chest, hands folded like a man in prayer. "I'm still here," he whispered when he saw her watching. She tried to smile. Couldn't. So she reached for his hand instead. When she was strong enough to sit by the fire again, the storm had passed. Not the fever, but the one that hung over her heart. They sat together, close now, their arms brushing. Outside the world was still suspicious. But inside, here, they were learning something the town couldn't name. Not love, not yet. But something warm and rooted and willing to grow, even in frozen ground. When Boaz rose to stoke the fire, Eloise watched him with a new kind of ache. Not fear, not doubt, but something gentler. He turned. "You all right?" She nodded. "Just thinking." About? "About how some fires don't burn," she said. "They just stay." He smiled. And this time she smiled back. The ground softened in March. It didn't ask permission. Snow receded like a curtain slowly being drawn, revealing brittle stalks, wagon ruts half filled with meltwater, and the long scars of winter left on fences and people alike. The prairie no longer groaned under the cold, it listened. Birds returned to the naked branches. Calves cried in distant fields. Even the air smelled like something new. But inside the Walker cabin the change was quieter. Eloise had recovered, though her body moved slower now, wrapped in a blanket more often than not. Boaz had begun building a new roof frame by hand, plank by plank, whistling under his breath like it was habit from another life. Neither of them spoke much of the past weeks. What had passed between them had not needed naming. It simply was. Like breath. Like firelight. They shared coffee now. Sat on the porch in the evenings when the sun dipped low and painted the world in rose and rust. She would knit. He would sand fence posts. Sometimes their knees would brush and neither would move. Sometimes she'd look up and find him already looking at her. It was for a brief time peace. Until the man in the black coat returned. He came riding just before dusk, the hooves of his horse soaked to the knees in red mud, his silhouette a dark smear against the horizon. Eloise saw him first, standing at the sink, wiping her hands on a cloth, when she caught sight of a rider crossing the east ridge. She went still. Boaz stepped beside her, following her gaze. His jaw tightened. "You know him?" She nodded slowly. "His name's Harlan Tate. Your father's deal." "Yes." She didn't say more. She didn't have to. The rider slowed as he neared the cabin, his eyes sweeping over the new roof frame, the stacked firewood, the man standing beside her. Then he dismounted, not bothering to tie the reins. "You've done well for yourself, Eloise," he said. His voice was dry like cracked tobacco. He removed his gloves with deliberate care. "I came to collect." Boaz stepped forward, body angled between them. "This land's hers. You've no claim here." Tate's lip curled. "I've got paper says otherwise. A deal made years ago. This girl was promised to me. Now I hear she's married, fraudulently, without proper witness or priest. That makes her mine again." "I'm not a mule," Eloise said. "No," Tate replied. "But you were bought. Don't matter if the horse got sick on the way, deal still holds." Boaz stepped down from the porch. "You need to leave." "I'll leave with her," Tate said, pulling the paper from his coat. "You want to fight? You'll get it." Eloise came down the steps, wind catching her shawl. Her voice didn't rise, but it cut through the dusk like flint against steel. "You want to hold a girl to a contract her father made with whiskey on his breath? You want to drag me back to a past you think I still belong to?" Tate didn't answer. She reached out and took the letter from his hand. Held it up. "This contract sold a girl. But I am a woman now. And that man you see beside me, he didn't buy me. He stood beside me when your kind tried to make me disappear. He stayed when I was sick. He watched over me without ever asking for more than a name. Can you say the same?" The crowd was already forming at the edge of the road, townsfolk drawn by the sound of argument, the scent of something scandalous. Judge Whitlow was there and Fern Tilly and half the church board. Tate sneered. "That's a nice story, but this paper holds up in court." Boaz took a step forward. "So does fire." He struck a match. Held it up. Waited. Eloise said nothing. She took the match from Boaz's fingers, set it to the edge of the paper, and watched as the flame took. The contract curled in her hands like a dying leaf, turning to ash that scattered on the wind. The town gasped. Judge Whitlow started to speak, but Eloise lifted her hand. "I've had enough of being quiet so other people can sleep easier. If any of you still think I'm the girl who needed saving, you're wrong. I didn't marry Boaz to escape my past. I married him because he never asked me to be anyone but myself." A long silence followed. Then someone clapped. Just once. Then again. Deputy Lem, eyes wide, began nodding, and a few others followed. Even Fern Tilly looked away, folding her arms, her mouth pressed thin but silent. Harlan Tate said nothing. He gathered the reins, mounted his horse, and rode away without another word. That night, Eloise lit a second lamp. She laid out plates for supper without asking. Boaz came in quietly, washed his hands at the basin, then sat beside her. His eyes searched hers, but he didn't speak. "You're still here," she said softly. "I told you," he replied. "I stay." She reached across the table and took his hand. No ceremony. No applause. Just the still warmth of something earned. Spring came fully a week later. The fields turned green at the edges, like memory trying to forgive itself. They built a new fence that month. The posts went in straight. The gate creaked less than before. On Sundays, Eloise returned to church. People didn't speak, but they didn't turn away. Boaz walked beside her. No one questioned it. On the porch one evening, Eloise leaned her head against his shoulder and whispered, "It was never about saving me." "I know." She paused. "It was about letting me be seen." "I saw you the first night," he said. "Even when you didn't." They watched the prairie grow gold with sunset, the sky soft with promise. And in that hush, between dusk and dark, something in her settled. Not because life had made sense, but because it had made room. Some stories don't end in kisses or confessions. Some end in silence shared between two people who chose to stay. And in this world, that's more than enough. If you've ever been written off, misjudged, or quietly endured more than they'll ever know, remember this. Sometimes, survival looks like a woman standing tall with ash in her palm. Sometimes, love speaks loudest when it says nothing at all. And sometimes, the fire they thought would burn you down becomes the light you build a home by. Stay soft. Stay standing. And let them wonder how you survived.